Now we're officially started. Okay. So, thank you so much for coming. For those of you who had read the title on the kind of the listings, it's changed a little bit. It is only AAPI representation in jazz, not popular music, just because that's a whole different thing, and I didn't want to kind of shortchange that. So, we're going to talk about AAPI representation in jazz. What does AAPI mean? Asian American Pacific Islander, which it is Asian American Pacific Islander Month, if you did not know, so this is very timely. So first and foremost, I wanted to just ask a question to all of you. Just seeing that title, what kind of names, musicians come to mind?
Helen Song.
Yeah?
Hiromi. Forgetting her last name.
Uhara.
Uhara, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Miho Hazama.
Yeah.
You're playing some Makoto. Makoto Zane.
Yeah. All awesome names. A lot of those are in this presentation, so well done. But hopefully you're going to come away from this presentation with a lot more names. So why this topic? First and foremost, I just wanted to personally explore my own kind of Japanese American ancestry and what that meant in a musical context. I wanted to try to understand what the current state of AAPI representation is in jazz in this world. What have I been missing? What kind of people can I meet through this? I've met a lot of cool people just through this project and be able to talk to them. Obviously, I want to find a deeper appreciation for the whole kind of, diaspora of different Asian cultures that make up Asian American Pacific Islander. That does not just mean East Asian. It encompasses South Asian, kind of Western Asia to Northern Asia, which is Russia. We won't get into that. But it means a lot. So we're going to see a lot of different countries represented in this presentation. And as we kind of explore this music, there's actually really cool music that is very influenced by this culture. It's not just Asian players playing bebop or playing the music at the time. They really take their own culture into account sometimes, and it's just a really cool subgenre. And then, of course, I wanted to help inform you all about just these amazing musicians, the rich history of this entire community, and kind of just be able to show you and tell you the kind of things that I've picked up along the way. So in terms of what I used to kind of research with this, I did the usual scholarly research, so NPR articles, downbeat articles, things like that. Obviously, I did a lot of listening to a lot of different artists to kind of see where their influences came from and see how they use their culture in their music. And then a big part of it was I did interviews with members of the API jazz community. Some who are in this room, thank you, Ken. I'm looking, is Jay here? No, Jay, that's okay. So thank you, Ken. And this is a quick list of people I was able to interview for this process. Good family friend, longtime family friend, Larry Honda, back from Fresno. A friend, Jon Hatamiya, who's a fantastic trombonist, composer, educator down in Los Angeles at the moment. He's teaching at USC. Long friend, Ethan Santos, who is from my hometown, but he is now in New Orleans, kicking butt in New Orleans. Many of you know Masaki Kleinkopf, graduated last year from the U of O in the master's program. He's now in Los Angeles as well, actually. I did interview Jay. I interviewed Ken, so thank you, Ken, in the back. And then pianist and educator Kei Akagi, who I'll talk about him a little bit more later, but he was just a wealth of knowledge on the subject. Gary Fukushima, another great pianist and educator in the LA area up at Northridge, or down, I guess, in Northridge. And then Taku Hirano, who, interestingly enough, we went to the same elementary school. I found that out when I interviewed him, but he's, I think in my mind, probably one of the most sought after percussionists today in the popular music world. It was just so fun to be able to talk to him. But that's about 9 people I interviewed. They were all about hour interviews a piece. So it was really fun to just try to soak in all that knowledge. So what I'm going to do for this part of the presentation is I'm just going to give you a very brief kind of rundown of the history of this representation in kind of the jazz genre, going all the way back to like the 30s, and then we'll kind of move our way up. So this is early examples of representation, so pre-1960s. It's really hard to find. So I only have 3 for this one, but there are 3 really big ones that I think we should know about. First and foremost, for those of you drummers out there, is anyone familiar with Danny Barcelona?
No.
Awesome. Well, now you're going to be. Danny Barcelona was the drummer for Louis Armstrong for about 15 years. Starting in, I think, 1958. He was born in Honolulu. And I have my notes right here. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't just like a one-off. The fact that he played with Louis Armstrong for 15 years by itself just kind of shows the musician he was, the character he had. Obviously, it was his playing that did the talking, but someone really should check out. I do have a video of him later. James Araki was a multi-instrumentalist. He played trumpet, he played alto saxophone, he played piano. He is kind of considered one of the pioneers of bringing bebop to Japan. He was also born in Honolulu. He was interned in the Japanese internment camps in World War II, and that's where he learned saxophone. And then after World War II, when they had, like Japanese or American occupation in Japan, he was over there as a translator, and that's when he was able to kind of share this language with the Japanese people. And then Willie Mae Wong, big thanks to Paul and Steve when we were talking about this in my hearing. They brought her up. She's the first one on this list. She was a member of the, I think, International Sweethearts of Swing, which was an all-female integrated swing band in the late 30s and 40s. And you should know them for a lot of reasons. But one of those members was Willie Mae Wong, who was half Chinese and then half mixed. She was part African American, she was part white. So kind of a really interesting kind of blend of cultures there. But because at this time, you didn't see a lot of women playing jazz at all. So this band was a huge thing. And to see an Asian woman playing jazz was even cooler. So that was Willie Mae Wong. She's a baritone saxophonist. And I have a brief clip of Danny. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. Turn it up a little bit. Hoping you would cue it back in, but I guess it goes a little long. It's a long solo, but I mean, yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of videos of Danny Barcelona, so this was a really cool video to find. Another thing that makes him special in terms of all the people I've been looking at is he's one of the very few Filipinos on this list. So South Asian representation. Just really cool to see that because a lot of what you're going to see today is more East Asian and Japanese specifically, and we'll talk about that. but Danny Barcelona was a huge figure at that time. So, now we're going to go kind of like 60s to 80s. That's kind of a loose definition because some of these artists came over in the 50s, but they really came into prominence in the 60s and 80s. So, first one, now I get to talk about Kei. Kei Akagi is an incredible pianist, keyboardist, and educator who, I think he said the first person he came and played with when he moved to the States. He's originally from Japan. He came over, moved to Cleveland when he was a kid, and he went back. And then he came back in his 20s, I believe, to kind of study here. And he's been in LA and New York. But he played with Blue Mitchell. He played with Miles Davis in kind of those late 80s Tutu world tours, playing keyboards. He's played with Alan Holdsworth, among others. And he's just incredible. I'll show you a video of him play with Miles later. But he's also just an incredibly sweet human being that I was able to interview and very wise in the process. Another one was Sadao Watanabe. He is also born in Japan. He came to study at Berklee College of Music in 1962. And then he went back to Japan. He spent most of his time, still does, he's still alive, kind of making his life in Japan and being an early pioneer of jazz in the era, that country. But he was an early collaborator with Toshiko Akiyoshi, who I will talk about in a second. But he's also played with Chick Corea, Jack DeZanette. He has an album with them, I think in like the early 70s or very late 60s. So he was someone who got around, played with some of the biggest cats of the time. Teramasu Hino, kind of same story. He's a trumpet player who came from Japan, settled in New York about 1974, and is widely known as one of the most prominent kind of Japanese jazz musicians. He's played with a slew of artists. He kind of goes back and forth from New York and Japan, but he has played with like Elvin Jones, Gil Evans, so back in the day. But he's still making music now. And just another fantastic trumpet player. And then here's the big one, Toshiko Akiyoshi. For all of you composers out there, have you ever heard her name before? Don't even have to be composer, just you've known the name. Steve, you can raise your hand. Thank you. See?
Yeah.
Don't be shy. So Toshiko Akiyoshi is kind of a fascinating story. She was born in China to Japanese immigrants, and kind of with the wars and stuff is kind of going back and forth. But eventually she came to study at Berklee, and she's a big band writer for a lot of the stuff she does. She came to the States. She's a great bebop piano player. Just a great piano player in every right. But she very much took her Japanese culture into influence when she was writing. And not only was she a Japanese artist in America, but she was also a female band leader, which, again, that's a whole different presentation. And she's just a huge pioneer for, the female jazz community, the Asian jazz community, all of those. And a lot of people consider her one of the biggest composers just in that generation. With no labels, just composers in general. So I actually have a little bit of her. This is like the whole album, so we're just gonna kind of. Nope, we're gonna listen to the beginning. I don't know how I got there. From the beginning. So this is Long Yellow Road. This is the Blue Tabakan Big Band, which was her, I believe, husband. They had a big band together. This is 1974. All these recordings, I have a huge playlist of all the YouTube recordings that I've showed in this presentation. To other ones I just didn't have the time to show. So you can go back and listen to this if you want. This is the whole album. You should buy the album, but if you wanted to listen for reference, it is here. I think hold on. Let's not go full screen. I think I locked myself out of my present. There we go. And now here's a clip of Kei. Let's skip ahead. Stop it. Yeah, Kei's a monster. This is all the way back in 1990. So this was at the very kind of end of Miles Davis's life when they were still touring with Tutu. But yeah, that's just a taste. No. So, a little side kind of part of this presentation. Because if you kind of noticed maybe that a lot of the artists I mentioned for kind of like the 60s to 80s, so that's like post-World War II. It was a lot of first-generation Japanese musicians coming over from Japan with, actually all of them did. So I do want to kind of talk about jazz in Japan in kind of very small kind of discussion about why it became such a fad in Japan. So, there was a big jazz boom in Japan after World War II, which is interesting because Japan lost the war, and then you had American military occupation. So, it doesn't always seem like the most conducive environment to adopt a very, very American genre of music. But you had all those troops in Japan, and they still wanted their classic dance bands. They still wanted to hear jazz. So they brought that music over with them. A lot of these soldiers were great musicians in their own right. So they were playing in these dance bands, but they also, I said that already, were teaching this music to the locals. They were teaching it to Japanese musicians who, needed work. And it's like, well, we have this dance band for these, these military balls, what have you. And they would learn the music. They would just sit in on the gigs. They would sight read. And they just became really infatuated with the music. As I was having conversations with Kei, he kind of said, jazz was the music of the victorious, which is a really interesting way to put it. But it's true. With Japan having lost the war, they kind of wanted a new identity. And, jazz is, it's the music of oppression. It's not just like standard, popular music. It has really deep roots. And Japanese musicians and people really connected with that. So there was just all these kind of little factors that just worked really well at the time. Everything kind of lined up for jazz to do really well in Japan. And this was, again, back in like the 50s and 60s when this happened. So it's had a lot of time to grow. So now we have like the Blue Note Tokyo. You have incredible artists of all genres, but jazz genre especially, who consider, Japan, Tokyo especially, one of the biggest jazz kind kind of places in the world. That's including like Europe and New York. And that's because it's had like all this time to grow, and the Japanese people just really latched on to this music. So it's really interesting, and kind of an important side note. But with that said, I do want to make the distinction. We are talking about a lot of artists today that immigrated over from Japan. And that is an incredibly important part of this conversation. But another important part of this conversation is to realize that while there are so many Japanese artists coming over from Japan, coming over from other countries, we don't have as many artists who were born in this country. Japanese Americans of, my generation, Ken's generation, where we were, actually Ken, you were born here.
I was born here.
But you are first generation, technically. Yeah. Second generation. But your brother was born in Japan.
Yeah.
Right. So you have not as many kind of Asian American, if you want to call it that, people who grew up in America who are going into the jazz genre. But part of the conversation is to be able to show, I was finding all these artists from Japan, and it's really inspiring to me. And it's helping me want to be in this genre more. Not that I'm already aren't deep in it. But there is an important distinction with that. So with that said, we'll kind of look into a little bit more modern, so 90s, kind of 2000s. So these are a lot of the artists that you might have mentioned before. And this is kind of an era where we start seeing a lot more. Some more people coming over from Japan, but you also see more people who were born here who adapted jazz as kind of in the kind of the political sense, and really used it. This was like, a lot of free jazz coming out at this time with Asian American musicians, because they connected with the same kind of struggles that people like, Charles Mingus was really big in writing very political music. And it was very, I don't know if you want to use the word aggro, but it really got deep into emotion, and you'll hear some of that with some of these artists. But the first one is a PNW local. Anyone know Kwang Vu? He is the jazz, he is the Steve equivalent up at University of Washington. An incredible trumpeter who played with Pat Metheny, among others. Dave Douglas, David Bowie. He was born in Vietnam, and then he came over to Seattle when he was 6. So he has considered Seattle home for a very long time. He has deep roots in the PNW, but someone who slept on a lot.
Slept on?
Slept. Thank you. Someone who is even more slept on is Glenn Horiuchi. He is someone that I personally found as I was going through kind of my research. He's a pianist who did a lot of stuff in the 90s. He has passed, but he was, again, born in America, and then he was one of the first people who was involved with Asian Improv Records, which I will talk about in a little bit, which was a record label that was specifically designed to give Asian artists voices. Helen Sung, who did a wonderful masterclass with us virtually last year, she's a kind of a giant, kind of especially in the education and kind of global outreach of jazz. Helen, where is it? Was born in Houston. She went to the Monk Institute, what formerly was the Monk Institute in LA. But she has done a lot of ambassadorship around the world with, I should use my pointer so I can show you pictures. That's Helen, if you didn't know. But she's done a lot of great work, not only here in the States, but around the world, being an ambassador to jazz. John Jang is one of the founding members of Asian Improv Records, wonderful pianist and composer, and I will show you an example of his music, but he very much took his culture into account. he was born here in the States. He was born in the Bay Area. And he went to Oberlin. That's a note that I have. But he really was big, and is still big, in giving a lot of Asian artists voices. And then I would hope a lot of us are familiar with Linda Oh, the wonderful bassist, who is from Australia, if you didn't know that. But she is, I don't know how much I have to say about Linda Oh, but she's one of the most prominent bass players in the game today, based out of New York. She went to Manhattan School of Music, kind of in the early late is the entire 2000s. Let's call it mid 2000s. She went to MSM, and she has stayed over here, has become a great collaborator with a lot of artists, including another incredible pianist, Vijay Iyer. Hands up if we know Vijay Iyer. I assume this is going to be one of the more popular names in this presentation. Vijay was born in New York, but he's a son of Indian immigrants. So it's getting some more South Asian representation in this list. But Vijay has been, just a giant in the game for a long time. But he actually had his first 2 records recorded under Asian Improv Records, which I believe is actually 2 slides after I have musical examples. So let's go through those first. No, it's right here. So, Vijay Iyer recorded his first 2 under Asian Improv Records, which was founded by John Jang in 1987 with his collaborator, Francis Wong, another wonderful saxophonist. And on their website, they say that Asian Improv Records was founded as a vehicle for Asian American composers, performers, and their collaborators to release music to the public as leaders during the time of emergence of the Asian American consciousness movement. So like I was saying before, this was a political movement where a lot of Asian Americans were kind of being inspired by a lot of the civil rights conversations and kind of protests happening at the time, and they felt like they had their own story to tell, and they had their whole kind of other things to fight for Asian Americans. So John Jang and Francis Wong were a big part of that, but they used music as a vehicle to be able to kind of insert themselves into the conversation. So some early releases on this label included Jang's, the very first one was The Ballad of the Bullet, and then Glenn Horiuchi had a few early records under this label, including Next Step, Issei Spirit, and Man's in Our Voices. Issei meaning first generation. Man's in Our Voices, Man's in Ours where one of the internment camps were. So even, within the music, you'd hear a lot of influence, but even with the titles, this is coming from a very deep and personal place. And then some other artists that recorded, like I said, Vijay recorded his first 2. Fred Anderson, who was one of the founding members of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians out of Chicago, did some work with them. And then Max Roach actually was part of a trio, they called it the Beijing Trio with John Jang. I don't have that recording in this presentation, but it is in my playlist if you want to check it out. So here's a quick little example of John Jang's Come Sunday, arrangement of Come Sunday, off of his record Tiananmen in 1989. You will be able to hear very distinct, he uses cultural and traditional instruments within this, or has our Western instruments kind of trying to mimic those sounds. more to the free stuff. It's very eclectic. But it does have, like, again, a lot of influence from traditional culture in the composition, in the instruments, in the approach. But it has that influence of kind of this very deep personal relation that a lot of artists have with free jazz and kind of just expression at the time. Just for time purposes, I'm going to skip over Glenn. Apologies. But again, all of this stuff is on my playlist. So now is the time we get to really talk about the big part of this conversation, which is representation. So before we get into that part of the presentation, I want to just kind of throw it out to all of you. What does representation mean? What do you think it means? It can mean a lot of different things to different people.
Participation, collaboration. There's another word I'm going for.
No, that's great. Yeah, participation, collaboration,
Contribution.
contribution.
Visibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it
Henry?
means making visible voices that traditionally have not been heard.
Right, absolutely. We'll go Ben.
Respect.
Yeah, respect, absolutely. All those are all correct, wonderful answers. And just kind of proves, again, representation means a lot of different things. So with that said, do you believe that there is an underrepresentation of the API community in jazz?
Yes.
You can just get, yeah, if you vocalize it, nod of heads, shaking of heads if you disagree. So in my conversation, this is where kind of my interviews are going to play a bigger part in the conversation. Everyone I talk to, big yes. Now it means different things. What does underrepresentation mean? But we all agree that it not necessarily it's a problem, but it's something that is happening in our musical world, but it is growing. So that's an important notion to have. So what do you think are some factors that may have contributed to the underrepresentation of API community in jazz? Again, there's no right answers here, but
Were you trying to say that underrepresentation was growing or representation is growing?
representation is growing.
Okay,
Not
well,
underrepresentation.
I was hoping so.
That would be counterproductive.
It's growing, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Andrew.
Physical location to the place where jazz has originated, in terms of being in the States, specifically New Orleans, New York, places like that, and then I think naturally reaching farther and farther out as time goes on,
Mm-hmm.
you will find more representation. That's my thought.
Okay, yeah. Brian?
Cultural upbringing,
Yeah. You want to elaborate?
just the stereotypical but also very true upbringing of this isn't something that can contribute to us as a people and for your career, so don't do it.
Yeah. It's unfortunate but true for a lot of people. And conversations I was having with Taku, actually, we were talking about kind of just upbringing. It's not, we kind of look at it as like a negative, like, oh, they're crushing dreams. But if you really want to think about it from an immigrant standpoint, if you're first generation immigrant and you work so hard to get here to this country, all you want is the best for your children, best for, your family. So, yeah, being a musician doesn't always look like the most successful music bringing or money, getting career. So it worried a lot of parents, for sure. Yeah. Anybody else?
I mean, along with that, I'd just say like socioeconomic setbacks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Of course.
And also racism has played such a role.
Unfortunately, yes. maybe one or two more, and then we'll kind of go through the list that I compiled.
Yeah, kind of going off of that, I mean, we were talking about it going as far back as when, like, Japanese internment camps, so I think that definitely had a part to play in it at the beginning, which is most super unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
Could also be in the education system of jazz education, where, I mean, rightfully so, African Americans are placed at the forefront of the genre, and then there's a lot of talk about how white people were adopting it, but it kind of tends to stay in that, that with that kind of commentary, rather than expanding out to how it's expanded to Asian American countries. Often there's like America, started here in America, African American culture, and then expanded to Europe, and it's like commonly the talk, but you don't hear a lot about how it expanded to Japan in post World War II and stuff like that.
Absolutely, and on that point, I'll get to you too, Avery. That's why a lot of Japanese artists were coming to America, going to Berkeley. I mean, Berkeley was one of the first kind of jazz studies programs, places you could come and actually study, and you couldn't do that in Japan for a while. You can now, but just like lack of access to that kind of educational system as well. Avery, will be the last one.
Yeah, sure. I think it kind of tied into the idea of racism a little bit, but it was also kind of like the concept of things I've read about in some like musicology articles and stuff like that, like otherness, things being like typecast for being different, not necessarily because they're any worse or better, but they're just maybe out of the typical canon of maybe what Westerners were used to.
Absolutely. That's probably one of the biggest points I'll get to on the next slide. And out of all my interviews, I had this conversation with Kei Akagi, and the biggest thing he kept coming back to was just expectation. Mm-hmm. So it's, if you close your eyes and like, look at, what do you imagine a jazz musician looks like? You're not going to envision probably an Asian person in that role, right? So even if there are a lot of people in that jazz world, they're so scattered, and you maybe see one here or there, and it surprises you when you see it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but why does it surprise you? It's because it was not the cultural norm, still isn't. So some of the things that I was able to talk to people about in interviews, these are just things we talked about. These are not all the answers, far from. So we talked about, financial hardships and just the stigma of pursuing a jazz as a career. Kudos to all of you for studying it in college. Kind of Brian brought it up a little bit. That kind of the model minority myth in terms of you're expected to excel. You are expected to be a doctor, be a nurse, be a lawyer, make money. And a musician doesn't always do that. Lack of exposure to kind of the art form, right? Japan didn't really get that exposure until after World War II. We see a lot of other East Asian or kind of South Asian countries who still don't have like all that exposure, right? Which is why Japan's a little bit farther ahead in terms of the jazz world there. But we're starting to see more. Kei was talking to me about like that there's a budding scene in Korea right now. We talked about kind of higher education, lack of access to important resources. So whether that's like, again, conversation I was having with Taku, it's like, well, he's like kind of a global percussionist. He does a lot of different things. It's like if you want to study like Latin music, you should be able, you really should go and try to go to New York or stuff like that. That's not the easiest thing to do, based on like socioeconomic status, or just ability to kind of travel and kind of get these things, or just instruments, right? You can't really practice like or conga, say, if you don't have a conga, or if you don't have a horn or a piano. And then obviously there were a lot of racial tensions post-World War II. Even though there were artists around, not everyone wanted these artists in their bands. There's a lot of lack of integration for most of kind of the 1900s. And then, like we said, struggle to change expectations. So, I want to talk briefly. I'm not going to really go into detail about all these artists, but some that you should probably know who are active today. Reina Terakubo, who is a fantastic alto saxophonist. I will probably show a clip of her. As someone who grew up being infatuated by like Maynard Ferguson, Eric Miyashiro is one of the best lead players in the world. He is from Hawaii. He was in the All-American College, or not All-American College Band, McDonald's All-American High School Band, I think, like back in the day. I always thought he was from Japan, but he's from Hawaii. You mentioned Hiromi Ohara earlier, incredible pianist. Jin Shu is an incredible vocalist. I'm going to mention Jon because I think Jon is one of the kind of more budding names on the scene in LA. Again, a great friend of mine, but he's just a fantastic performer and educator. Taku Hirano, again, percussionist I was able to talk to. Tamaya Honda, who is a drummer, played with Kei, does a lot of things in Japan. Linda Mehan Oh, talked about her earlier. Makoto Ozone, I think Avery kind of mentioned it earlier. I heard that name, Taku's like, he did like the Global All-Stars band. He's like, that's where I met Makoto Ozone, and he's a freak. He's incredible.
Have you heard any of his stuff with like Gary Burton?
Yeah, I listened to it a little bit.
Yeah.
Miles Okazaki, who I think teaches at Michigan.
Yeah, he was going to be my teacher initially when I was going to go to college, but had other plans.
Well, now you're here.
Yeah, Miles is great.
Takuya Kuroda, another from Japan, really great writer and trumpet player, very much kind of in kind of the newer genre scene. And there's so many more. So I'll show you a little bit of right now. This will be the last listening example. Just to show her going. She's just gnarly. And this is like with Ron Carter and some other people. That's all I got. We'll skip over Hiromi, unfortunately. But, I mean, she's amazing. You should check her out. So, at this time, if anyone would like, I'll post this just like Avery posted his QR code. Thanks for the idea.
Welcome, man.
This is a very large playlist that will be ever growing that I've made of just AAPI artists in the genre. There's a lot of music on there, but there's also some like interviews and stuff if you want to kind of get into that and kind of watch conversation as well. So this will come back. So that's there. So again, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but how would you view the current state of AAPI representation in jazz? Maybe it's changed after I've shown you all these artists. Maybe it hasn't. But I want to pose that question to you before I kind of tell you my 2 cents.
Growing.
Absolutely.
The example of the growth is on the recent Downbeat magazine. Miho Hazama was on the front cover, and so they shed light and they illuminated her presence.
Yeah, absolutely. Avery?
I think it depends. Part of it also can kind of depend on where you are in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Because you may have a certain view being in Eugene versus like LA where I'm from, where I felt like there was a decent amount of Asian American jazz musicians, maybe not as much as there should be. There was still a lot of Asian American Pacific Islander jazz musicians out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian?
I think in the current time of like social media being a way to expose like not just yourself but to share others, like post about whatever they're doing with their music careers, it's now is the perfect time to really show the diversity that the jazz community has, especially outside of the stigma of African American musicians, Caucasian musicians, and whatnot. Breaking the stigma on social media is probably this is like the best time for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, there's so many communities that are kind of like underrepresented in the jazz world. Asian American Pacific Islanders are only one of them, right? So but like you said, this is a time where we can really give a voice and kind of a face to a lot of these artists and just kind of the community at large. Yeah, anybody else? Awesome. Well, yeah, I agree with everything you said. Like I had in that slide before. I think it's growing. I know it's growing. And every conversation I've had in my interviews and my reading, it's incredibly encouraging. But we have ways to go. And I do believe, yeah, this is a small note I had. And like Avery said, especially in like more diverse areas like LA and New York, you are seeing that diversity a lot more now than in places, say, Eugene, Oregon. I love Eugene, but it is not LA. So, I mean, what are some things we'd like to see in the future?
More presentations like this.
Oh, yeah.
I kind of hope this isn't my last time doing this, because
Yeah.
I still want to talk to a lot of people and be able to share this stuff, but you had...
Just more attention, more lifting them up, more
Mhm. Absolutely.
appreciating them for their
Yeah.
contributions in it.
Robert?
I guess I think it'd be cool to see like some statistics on this stuff, and then also maybe the representation in other genres of music or other art forms in general.
Yeah,
But I think like more presentations like this to kind of show like how much growth there's been
right.
is a cool thing.
Yeah, and again, I mean, some of this stuff isn't really quantifiable, which is really hard, right? It'd be really easy if I just went like, so here's the percentage of Asians that are in America, and here's the percentage that are playing jazz. That's lower. That's bad, right? But numbers don't tell the whole story, and that's why we had that conversation, like, why does it look the way it does, you know? And that's why I want to talk about what can we do. So, like we said, representation at every level, but that means students, educators is a huge one. Performers, band leaders, again, just being able to see yourself, right? See yourself on stage. I keep going back to Kei because Kei is, for a lot of people, was an incredible example. Taku specifically, we talked about it. And he's like, yeah, for me, when I saw Kei Akagi playing with Miles Davis and he came through town, I was like, wow, I can do that? Like that, you know, that's an option for me. That's a huge thing. And then, like I was having that conversation before, changing expectations. So, with that said, I mean, how do you think we can change expectations?
Share stories, share
Yeah. Mhm.
music of people, these great musicians.
Right? Anyone else?
Call people in rather than out.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian?
Just show a mutual respect for musicianship rather than looking at the person and be like, oh, well, you're Asian, I didn't expect you to be playing something like this.
Right. Yeah. And I think here when we talk about representation, it's like, okay, sure, like I'm gonna make a concerted effort to bring in like an Asian artist, you know, to play in my band or that kind of stuff. That is a double-edged sword, right? As much as we don't want to admit that, it is. So that's why you don't have to, you know, changing what the band looks like doesn't necessarily mean you're changing expectations. Maybe you're forcing expectations, but it's just, it's visibility. It's stuff like this, right? Being able to talk and show you all these artists. So like if you're going and teaching and like if you do like a listening every day, pick different communities to highlight every day in your listening. You don't always have to play, you know, Coltrane and Charlie Parker. Obviously you should. Those are like the stepping stones and kind of that is the tradition. But to not acknowledge amazing artists like this is to not acknowledge the entirety of what, you know, the jazz community looks like, right? So it's stuff like that. So I hope you can go from this and be able to kind of be curious about this community. And with that said, we talked about how did we get there. Let's see, how much time we get that? Let's talk about it for a little bit more. I think we talked about it. No, we did. That's kind of what we just talked about, huh? Well,
Further
yeah, go ahead.
expound on stuff.
Oh, you want me to further expand?
We all could. We could just
Yeah.
open it up for however, or whatever you're thinking.
Right. Well, There is a special presentation, if you will, at the end of this. So before we get there, are there any questions for me, for yourselves? Yeah, Max.
I feel like educators can really help at expanding in schools
Mm-hmm.
and like finding like good models of instrumentalists and bringing in guest artists too. That's a huge thing you talked about.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a good step forward.
Yeah, so which is why I really appreciate like having Helen song in last year. I didn't really know who Helen was. That's more on me, just like not checking people out. But that was really cool for me to see. Yeah, Avery.
Can you speak to your own personal experience and how your culture has impacted
Yeah.
your experience as a jazz musician?
Absolutely. So I'm fourth generation. I was lucky enough, my father was a great educator and drummer kind of in the Central Valley. And he did a lot of educating, and there was a great kind of Japanese community in the Central Valley. And there were actually a lot of Asian musicians because of that. So I grew up in a community where it wasn't weird at all. But I also knew kind of in the back of my mind that if I looked out kind of, past where I was growing up and I looked at the scene at large, I wasn't going to see that as much. But, you go around to festivals and, you see some of these adjudicators who are Asian American, and, you hear them play and it's like, that's so cool. It's like you go to Reno, huge festival. A lot of, people from Fresno would go and adjudicate. And I mean, Reno's just a huge festival, so there's a million adjudicators. But you do see a lot of cool representation there. That's where I met a lot of people. That's where I met Steve. Well, actually, no, I probably met you at, yeah, I met you in Fresno. But yeah, and then I think for me personally, like where it's kind of impacted me, other than the composition you're about to hear, I think it didn't have a lot of like direct impact into like my playing, but obviously, and this is a conversation I took out of this conversation because I didn't want to kind of get into stereotypes. But I think for me, like my work ethic as a kid and as a student was always really driven, and that didn't come from me being Asian at all. That didn't come from me like having parents that were really driving it. But I do think in the back of my head, like in my peers, kind of jokingly that was the expectation. So I went with it. And I was really driven a lot through school, especially academically, not as much on the musical side until I got to college. But I think in the back of my head, that's always kind of helped me. And as I've gotten more time on the horn, that's really helped me. So it's kind of a small answer, but yeah.
I was going to ask about some interesting things you learned in your interviews.
A lot of stuff I've talked about today. I mean, having those conversations about expectations. I mean, again, like talking to Taku, he grew up where I grew up. We went to the same elementary school, and it was just really cool to kind of have those conversations and just see how nice these people are, right? They're like big artists, but they're people too.
I had kind of a question and a comment to follow. So Did you record these interviews, Bridget?
Yes, they're all recorded.
I was going to say, you could transcribe these interviews, and this could be like a good, a good piece of writing or like a book or something. And then you can also expand. This would be like a good short book to write about.
Yeah. I don't like books, but I like that idea.
Yeah, I'll try to read it.
Yeah, me too.
I don't do reading.
Me too. Okay, for time purposes, no? Yes. I found this on the web. So last thing I want to do today, so one of the conversations I was having with people was how did being Asian American or being Asian, if you will, kind of influence your compositional and playing style? And everyone had different answers. Some people didn't influence them that much, but a big thing that I wanted to do as part of this was force myself, or give myself the opportunity to be able to try to write something with this kind of my culture in mind. So this tune is called Yonsei, so fourth generation Japanese American, and we're gonna spin this around, and it is very much pentatonic based, which admittedly kind of a cheesy way to go about it, but it was a way that I was able to kind of right? Quickly, less notes to think about. And it ended up kind of being like an extended blues form. And then when I had conversations with Ken about kind of integrating like a taiko-like drum beat. So it's kind of hard to explain what that means, other than it's a lot of like low end kind of bass drum, like low tom. But yeah, apologies, this is going a little bit long, but this is the last thing, I swear. So let's just do a couple times through the solo section. I'll do it since I wrote the dang piece. So, and we don't have to necessarily do the open solo at the top, so you can kind of go in the groove. Right. But this is Yonsei. 1, 2, 1. I will post that QR code by Avery, so don't get them mixed up. But you should, yeah, they're a little different. But you should scan them both because it's, I mean, I learned a lot from this. Yeah, I learned a lot from this, and I hope you can too. So, thank you again.
Thank you.
I'm not.
I saw him a few years ago at the DX. I don't figure out his name the whole time. found this. It's actually a whole project called Heritage, which, according to this bio, it seems to make the revitalization of jazz and electronic.
And button.